Father shocked to learn his daughter is the murderer. The room was dimly lit. Shadows clung to the corners. A single lamp flickered above, casting long streaks of yellow light across the hardwood floor. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of something unspoken. Detective Harris stood at the threshold, his face pale. He couldn't breathe. The photograph in his hands trembled, fingers barely able to hold it steady. It was her face, his daughter's face. He'd seen it before, but this time it was different. His heart raced. He glanced back at her, sitting quietly on the couch. Her eyes, cold and distant, avoided his gaze. There was a strange stillness in her, a calmness that sent shivers down his spine. "You're lying," he muttered. But the image in his hands didn't lie. The evidence, the crime scene, the pieces of the puzzle, they all pointed to her. "How?" he whispered, barely able to form the word. She looked up slowly, her lips curling into a small, almost imperceptible smile. There was no remorse in her expression, no fear. Just a quiet, unsettling certainty. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said softly. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Not at all." Harris took a step back, his mind reeling. The picture on the table beside him blurred in his vision. A family photo from years ago. He'd thought everything had been perfect. Her first smile as a child. Her first day of school. The day she graduated. All those memories, now shattered by the truth he couldn't deny. "I didn't want to," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I had no choice." His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the nearest chair. Everything he thought he knew about her, everything he loved, was a lie. How could it be? "Why?" he gasped, his voice cracking. "Why did you kill him?" Her gaze softened for the briefest moment. Then it hardened again. "Because he deserved it." The silence between them grew heavy. The clock ticked louder now, each second a deafening beat in his ears. He couldn't escape the truth he never saw coming. The silence hung thick in the air, oppressive. Harris's heart pounded in his chest. His mind screamed for answers, but none came. His hands trembled as they clutched the photo tighter. His eyes never left her. She stood now, slowly. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. She didn't look like the daughter he had raised. The girl who used to run to him with scraped knees, crying for comfort. That girl was gone, replaced by a stranger. Who did he hurt? Harris finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. The question felt hollow, like he wasn't even sure if he wanted to know. But he had to know. Her eyes flashed with something dangerous. Something sharp. "You don't understand, Dad." Her voice was low, but the words carried a weight that felt like a slap across his face. "You never understood him. You never saw how he treated me." Harris felt his stomach churn. A sinking feeling deep inside him, as if the ground was falling away beneath his feet. The man she spoke of, the one who had vanished without a trace, was her uncle, his brother. And the revelation hit him like a thunderclap. The man had always been distant, cruel even. But could he have been capable of what she claimed? The thought tore at him. He wanted to deny it, to stand up and tell her that she was wrong. But her face, her eyes, held an icy certainty. It was clear she believed it. She had no doubt. Harris's voice was hoarse. "Tell me, what did he do to you?" She stepped closer now, her presence overwhelming. He could feel the coldness radiating from her. Her words were sharp, but they hit like a whisper. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you?" Harris swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, as if the truth was choking him from the inside. She was different now, her calm demeanor almost unnerving. It was as if she had shed a part of herself, something innocent, something pure. And in its place, this. The room was suffocating. He could barely see her now, the edges of his vision darkening. All he could hear was the steady tick of the clock on the wall. "You were always my hero," she said, her voice low and slow. "But now, I have to be the hero." Harris's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the words fell on him like a crushing wave. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. "Why did you?" He started to ask, but she interrupted, her voice turning cold as ice. Because I had no choice, Dad. He hurt me, and I had to stop him. A tear slipped down his cheek. His daughter. The girl he had raised. The child who had looked up to him with innocent trust. Now she was the monster. The murderer. And the worst part? He still loved her. The love he felt for her twisted inside him, a knot of disbelief and anguish. How could he still love her after everything? After the blood on her hands? But the truth was undeniable. His hands were shaking now, but he reached out, almost involuntarily. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a plea. A desperate attempt to reconnect with the daughter he thought he knew. Please, he whispered. Please tell me this isn't real. Tell me you're lying. Tell me this is some nightmare I can wake up from. She didn't flinch. Her gaze was steady. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no sign of remorse. Just cold certainty. I wish it was, she said quietly, almost regretfully. But it's not. It's real, Dad. It's all real. The silence between them grew deeper. The air was thick with the weight of her confession, suffocating. Harris couldn't move. His body felt numb, as if every part of him had gone into shock. His mind couldn't process what she was saying. Her face remained unreadable. But there was something in the way she stood, the way she spoke, that made it clear. She had done this. And she wasn't sorry. Not in the way he wanted her to be. He stood up shakily, his legs unsteady beneath him. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, to escape this nightmare. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to understand. How could you? He choked out, his voice cracking with a rawness he hadn't known was possible. How could you kill him? Her eyes softened, just for a moment. Then they hardened again, the same steely resolve returning. Because he didn't stop. She took a step forward, and her voice dropped to a whisper. He didn't stop until it was too late. Harris's stomach twisted. He understood now. The hidden abuse. The things she'd never told him. The things she had kept buried inside her for years. But that didn't make it right. That didn't make it justifiable. That's not the way, he said, his voice barely audible. His hands were trembling uncontrollably now, his mind racing. He was torn between the need to protect her and the reality of what she had done. How could he be a father and a detective in this moment? How could he reconcile these two roles? She stood before him, unmoving, unwavering. You don't understand, Dad. I had to. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. He wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her see reason. But the truth was, there was no reasoning with her now. Not when she had crossed this line. A tear slipped from his eye, but he wiped it away angrily. He couldn't let himself break, not yet. Then what happens now? He asked quietly, almost to himself. What do we do now? She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Now you make a choice, Dad. Her voice was steady, almost calculating. Either you turn me in or you protect me. You can't have both. Harris felt the weight of her words crush him. The choice. The decision he never thought he'd have to make. He looked down at the photograph again. The smiling family he once knew was now a distant memory. His daughter, the killer, standing before him, unrepentant. His own flesh and blood. His world spun. And he realized, with a cold clarity, there was no going back. The air in the room grew colder, suffocating him. Harris stood frozen, staring at her, as though the floor beneath him might swallow him whole. The weight of her words, of the impossible choice she had laid before him, pressed down on him like an anchor. He could feel the world around him crumbling. What did he owe her now? What was the right thing to do? Was there even a right thing anymore? He glanced at the window. The city outside felt miles away, as if he were trapped in a different world entirely. The sounds of life, cars honking, people laughing, were distant echoes, fading into the silence between him and her. Her presence was overwhelming. The room seemed to shrink with each passing second, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He looked back at her. Her eyes were still cold, distant, but there was something else now, something darker. It was as if she had already made her peace with what she had done, with what she had become. I raised you, Harris whispered, his voice breaking. I try to protect you from the world. I wanted you to be happy. He paused, struggling to find the words. But this isn't you. This isn't the little girl I loved. Her lips parted, but it wasn't anger that flashed in her eyes. There was only a quiet sadness. I'm still that girl, Dad, she said softly. But sometimes you have to do things you don't want to. Sometimes you have to make hard choices, or they'll make them for you. His breath hitched in his chest. Her words felt like a blade, slicing through the last remnants of the father he used to be. He felt his knees give way, but he didn't fall. He was rooted to the spot, trapped in a world where nothing made sense anymore. What do you want from me? He managed to ask, his voice raw and ragged. I don't know what to do. She stepped closer, her movements almost graceful. For a moment, Harris thought he saw a flicker of the girl he remembered, the one who used to hug him tightly after a bad day at school. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating woman standing before him. I just want you to choose, Dad, she said, her tone final. Either you stand by me, or you let me go. But know this, if you let me go, everything changes. You won't be able to undo it. The room spun again. His mind reeled. He wasn't just her father anymore. Now, he was forced to make a decision that would tear apart everything he had ever known. Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. You have to decide who you are now, too. It was like the world had stopped moving, and all that was left was the silence of the moment. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, each passing second echoing in Harris's mind. Could he save her? Could he live with himself if he didn't? The thought of turning her in, of bringing her to justice, made his insides churn. But the thought of standing by her, of protecting her, twisted him in ways he didn't understand. Harris started, but his voice faltered. The words were there, hanging on the edge of his tongue, but they were too heavy to speak. What kind of father was he? What kind of man had he become? She stood there, waiting unmoving, as though she already knew his answer. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no sign of fear, no sign of regret. Make your choice, she repeated, her voice low and steady. Harris took a deep breath. His chest ached, and his mind screamed for a way out. But there was no escape. Not from her. Not from the truth. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find the words, trying to find the strength. And when he opened them again, he knew. He made his choice. His heart hammered in his chest as the weight of the decision settled in. Every part of him screamed to turn away, to run, to erase the moment. But there was no running from this. The silence stretched out, oppressive and endless. He could feel her eyes on him, steady, unwavering, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a final move. His breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about saving himself, too. It was about who he would be once this moment was over. The world outside seemed so distant now. The bustling city, the noise, the people. None of it mattered anymore. Everything had been reduced to this room, this cold truth between father and daughter. Harris took a step forward, his legs unsteady, like he was walking through quicksand. He knew what she wanted, but he wasn't sure if he could give it to her. He had always seen himself as a protector, a provider, a father. But this was something different. I don't know if I can do this, he whispered, his voice cracking. The words stung as they left his lips. But they were the truth. And in this moment, that was all he had left. She didn't flinch. Her face remained still, emotionless, like a stone mask. And then, just as quietly, she said, "You can." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. As if she already knew the answer before he did. Her cold gaze seemed to pierce through him, unraveling him piece by piece. She had been prepared for this moment, for this choice. But Harris? He hadn't been ready. "Please," he murmured, his voice barely audible. The words were thick with unshed tears. "Please, tell me you didn't kill him for nothing." She hesitated, just for a moment. Then, with chilling clarity, she said, "I did it for us." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The walls seemed to close in even tighter. He wanted to scream, to deny everything she was saying. But he couldn't. I did it for us, Dad. Because he would have destroyed us both. The truth hit him with the force of a punch. The man, his brother, had never been the man Harris thought he was. Had never been the man Harris had wanted him to be. But even so, his daughter had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And no matter what she said, she couldn't erase that. Harris tried to speak again, but his throat was tight, like a vice was closing around it. The decision was still hanging in the air, suspended between them, waiting to be made. Her eyes didn't waver. She had already made hers. I'm sorry, Dad. Her voice was low, sincere, but there was no turning back now. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was demanding something far worse. Her loyalty. The air was thick with tension. Harris could barely breathe, barely think. He wanted to run. He wanted to pretend this was all some twisted nightmare. But he couldn't. I'll protect you, he said finally, his voice hoarse. His words felt like betrayal, but they were the only words he could offer. He would protect her. And in doing so, he condemned himself. Her lips curved into a faint smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the smile of someone who had already known the outcome. Someone who had already won. Thank you, she whispered. And in that moment, Harris realized something. She wasn't the daughter he had once known. She was something else. Someone else. And he was no longer the man he had been either. The choices they had made had irrevocably changed them both. The room fell silent again. The clock ticked, but the seconds felt like hours. Outside, the city hummed with life. But inside, in this small room, everything was still. The stillness in the room was suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of it. Harris stood there, paralyzed, his mind racing. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The decision, no, the surrender had already been made. He had chosen her, and there was no going back. Her eyes never left him. The faint smile still lingered on her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was calm, too calm, as if this had all been a part of a plan long in motion. I need you to understand, she said softly, stepping closer, her voice almost a whisper. I didn't just kill him because of what he did to me. I did it because I knew you wouldn't, and I couldn't let him destroy everything we had. Harris swallowed hard. His throat felt raw, like he was choking on the weight of her words. The man she had killed, the man he had once called his brother, had been a monster. But Harris never thought it would come to this. What now? Harris managed to croak, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Where do we go from here? Her gaze softened, but only for a split second. Then, like a switch had flipped, it was cold again, determined. We move forward, Dad. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, as if consoling him. It's done now. We bury it, and we start fresh. Together. Her words were a knife to his heart. Start fresh? How could they ever start fresh after this? He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The last shred of the man he had been, the father he had tried to be, had crumbled into dust. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, each second stretching on, marking the end of something he couldn't name. The end of innocence. The end of trust. His daughter, his flesh and blood, had crossed a line so far beyond redemption that he couldn't even see it anymore. And he, the man who had sworn to protect her, had chosen to protect her from justice, from the consequences of her actions. He didn't know if he was protecting her, or if he was just trying to save what was left of himself. Maybe both. Maybe neither. The thought hit him with terrifying clarity. He had no idea who she was anymore. And worse, he didn't know who he was anymore, either. Where do we go now? He asked again, but this time his voice was small, fragile. She smiled. Not the faint, distant smile from before, but something deeper, more satisfied. Now, she said slowly, her voice almost tender, we move on. And you'll never have to make a choice like that again. Her words were a promise. But it wasn't one he wanted to hear. As she turned and walked away, Harris remained rooted to the spot, watching her retreating figure. He didn't know what he was feeling anymore. Fear? Guilt? Sadness? All of it, maybe. He wanted to scream, to yell at her, to tell her this wasn't right, that it couldn't be. But deep down, he knew. It was too late for that now. She had already won. The weight of her departure pressed down on him like an invisible hand, forcing the air out of his lungs. She was leaving him, walking away with the calm confidence of someone who knew they had already taken control. He could hear the soft click of the door as she closed it behind her, leaving him alone in the silence. Harris stood motionless, as if the room itself had frozen around him. His legs were numb, his mind a swirling mess of disbelief. His daughter, the person he had sworn to protect, the one he had loved unconditionally, had become someone unrecognizable. And he, in his desperation, had chosen to protect her from the very thing that could bring her back from the edge. The minutes dragged on like hours. The sound of the ticking clock felt like a drumbeat echoing through his skull. He wanted to move, to make something right, but he was paralyzed, frozen in the aftermath of the choice he'd made. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to live with this? The walls around him seemed to close in tighter, the room growing smaller, darker. He glanced at the photograph on the table, the one of their family from a simpler time. It was just a picture now, a memory of a life that no longer existed. He could still hear her voice, soft and steady in his mind. Asterisk, we move forward, Dad. Asterisk. Her words echoed through the silence, mocking him. But how? How could they move forward after this? His daughter was a killer. And he had just agreed to bury it. The thought was suffocating, twisting his stomach into knots. What had happened to the man he used to be? The man who would have stopped at nothing to bring justice, to do the right thing? Now, he was complicit in her crime, in her silence, in her lie. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. His breath caught in his chest. Was it the police? Had someone figured it out? Had the world finally caught up with him? But when he opened the door, it wasn't the authorities standing there. It was his partner, the one who had been by his side through thick and thin. Detective Emma Mitchell. Her face was grim, her eyes scanning him with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with worry. Harris didn't answer. He couldn't. Not when the weight of everything, every decision, every betrayal, hung so heavily in the air. She stepped inside without waiting for permission, her eyes immediately landing on the family photo on the table. She frowned, sensing something was off. "Harris, what's going on?" she asked, her tone turning sharp. "You've been distant lately, but this is different. You're not yourself." He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess, to make her understand. But he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to say it. She did it, he managed, barely above a whisper. Emma frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly lower, more cautious. His heart pounded in his chest. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, threatening to burst out of him. But the moment he opened his mouth to speak again, the door creaked open behind him. Harris froze. A cold chill ran down his spine. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. There, standing in the doorway, was his daughter. Her face was calm. Her eyes were unreadable, and in her hand, she held something small, metallic, and glinting in the dim light. For the first time, Harris felt a true wave of fear wash over him. He knew, deep down, that this was no longer just about her and him. It was bigger than that, much bigger, and he was in too deep to escape. Harris didn't move, his eyes locked on his daughter. The glint of metal in her hand caught the dim light from a lamp, sending a cold shiver down his spine. His heart pounded harder now, the rhythm erratic, as if it were trying to break free from his chest. Emma's eyes darted between him and the girl, confusion flickering across her face. But she didn't say anything, not yet. She sensed something wasn't right, something deeper than just a family crisis. And that something was about to unravel. Harris opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. His daughter, The girl he had loved, the child he had raised, was standing there, holding the same weapon that had ended his brother's life. But there was no fear in her eyes. No hesitation.
Why?
Emma's voice was low, cautious. It was the first time she had spoken, her gaze fixed firmly on the girl, who hadn't moved an inch. She wasn't pointing the weapon at anyone, but she didn't need to. The mere presence of it changed everything. "Stay back," Harris finally managed to say, his voice thick with dread. Emma took a step back instinctively, her hand inching toward her sidearm. She didn't draw it yet, but the tension in the room crackled. It felt like they were on the edge of something, teetering on the brink. His daughter's face remained calm, almost serene. Her grip on the weapon was steady, unshaken. She wasn't worried about being caught or being confronted. She was in control, as she always had been. But there was something new about her now, something darker. "I didn't think you'd be this weak," she said quietly, her voice eerily calm. Her eyes met Harris's, and in them, he saw something chilling. Something that made him want to step back, to run, to escape. But he couldn't. He was already too far gone. He had already made his choice. "Why, Emily?" Harris asked, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. "Why did you come back here with that?" The question was as much for himself as it was for her. How had it all come to this? How had his love for her led him down this path, where he was forced to choose between loyalty and justice? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked closer, slowly, as if savoring the moment. Every step was deliberate, measured. "I didn't come back for you, Dad," she finally said, her words quiet but sharp. "I came back for what's mine." The finality in her voice hit him like a slap. She wasn't asking for his forgiveness, nor was she seeking his approval. She wasn't the little girl he once held in his arms. She was something else now. Something unrecognizable. Emma's hand was on her gun now, fingers tightening on the grip, but she didn't pull it out just yet. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Harris could feel his entire world shifting beneath him, like the very foundation of his life was crumbling away. The choices, the betrayals, the lies, all of it had led to this moment. And there was no way to stop it. No way to make it right. "Put it down, Emily," Harris said, his voice hoarse, pleading. But his words were hollow. He knew deep down that it wouldn't work. She had already made her choice. Emily stopped a few paces away from him, still holding the weapon loosely in her hand. For a moment, everything was still. Her eyes never left his. And in that silence, it felt like time itself had stopped. Harris felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't tear his gaze away from her. He couldn't look away. Because if he did, he feared he would lose her forever. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice low but certain. "You don't get it, do you?" Her eyes flashed with something that wasn't rage, but something colder, calmer. "You've spent your whole life trying to protect me, Dad. But the truth is, I'm beyond saving. And I don't need saving." Harris wanted to scream. He wanted to tell her how wrong she was, how much he loved her. But he couldn't. The words felt useless. She wasn't the girl he had raised anymore. And he wasn't the father he used to be. There was no going back from this. No undoing the damage they had both done. And in that moment, Harris knew he had lost her. For good. The air in the room felt impossibly thick now, like every breath Harris took was weighted, dragging him down. His chest tightened with the full realization of what she had become, and what he had allowed her to become. He had failed her, in every way that mattered. She was no longer the daughter he had fought so hard to protect. She was a stranger, someone who had taken a life without hesitation and now stood before him, calm and unwavering, as if it were just another step in her plan. And he had stood by her. He had made the choice to shield her from the consequences. He had chosen loyalty over truth. And now, as he looked into her eyes, he knew it was too late to take it all back. "You don't need saving," he repeated her words, but they sounded hollow in his mouth. What kind of father let his child fall so far? What kind of man had he become? Emily's lips twitched at the corners, just slightly, as if she were amused by his inner turmoil. But there was no warmth in her smile, only the cold satisfaction of someone who had already won. She wasn't angry with him. No, she didn't need to be. She had already broken him. "You're just a pawn, Dad," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "You always were. You never saw it." The words stung, but they were true. He had been blinded by love. Blinded by the belief that he could save her, that she was still the girl who once trusted him with her deepest fears, her quietest dreams. But that girl had died a long time ago. Harris couldn't breathe. The room spun, the walls pressing in on him like a vice. He was suffocating in this realization, drowning in the weight of his own choices. It wasn't just her that he had failed, it was himself, too. Emma, still standing near the door, was frozen. Her hand still hovered near her gun, but she hadn't drawn it. She had been watching, waiting for a sign, but it never came. And now, all she could do was wait for the inevitable, for whatever came next. Harris looked at her, his partner, his closest ally. She wasn't just confused anymore. She was scared, and she had every right to be. He opened his mouth, but the words got caught in his throat. What was left to say? How could he explain this to her? How could he explain it to himself? "You're still the man you always were, Dad," Emily said, her tone softening ever so slightly. "You just need to accept it." There was no remorse in her voice, no trace of guilt. She had embraced this path fully, and he had walked it with her. Harris looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in what felt like forever. And he saw it, something that made his stomach churn. There was nothing of the innocent girl he had raised. There was nothing of the child who had clung to his hand when she was scared, who had asked for his help when the world seemed too big. In front of him stood someone far more dangerous, someone far more calculating. And yet, a part of him still loved her. A part of him wanted to believe that the daughter he had once known was still somewhere inside her. But deep down, Harris knew that he couldn't save her. Not now. The truth hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. He couldn't save her because she didn't want to be saved. He had lost her. And it wasn't just her that was lost. It was him, too. Emma's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and urgent. "Harris," she said, taking a cautious step toward him, "you need to make a decision. What are you going to do?" Harris's head snapped toward her. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to say it. He didn't want to face it. "I don't know," he whispered. His voice was hollow. He didn't know what to do anymore. There was no right choice. Not now. The room seemed to collapse in on him. His entire world, his life, his choices, his love for his daughter, was crumbling to dust before his eyes. And in that moment, Harris knew. He was as trapped as she was. The silence between them was unbearable. And yet, it felt like the only truth left. His daughter stood there, waiting for him to say something, anything. But what could he say? What was left to say when everything had already been decided for them both? The door behind them creaked open again, and this time, it wasn't just the room that seemed to freeze, it was the world itself. And Harris knew, then, with terrifying certainty, that whatever happened next, it wouldn't just be about his daughter anymore. It would be about him, too. The door creaked open again, and Harris didn't need to turn around to know what had happened. It wasn't just the door opening. It was the final moment, the point of no return. A figure stepped into the room, tall and imposing, their presence so heavy that it seemed to darken the space further. Harris's heart skipped a beat. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were pressing in on him from all sides. He didn't need to see the person's face to recognize the cold power that radiated from them. The stranger spoke, their voice low and dangerous, cutting through the thick silence. Well, they said, the words dripping with amusement. "Looks like we're all finally here." Harris's body went rigid. He had never seen this person before, never heard their voice. But the weight of their words, the certainty behind them, made something inside Harris tremble. His daughter didn't even flinch. She just stood there, still as stone, her hand still holding the weapon. She wasn't surprised. She had known this was coming. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" the stranger asked, his eyes scanning the room with an eerie calm. Harris's pulse quickened. Who was this person? And why did they feel so much like a predator circling its prey? Emma, her hand still hovering over her weapon, slowly stepped back, clearly sizing up the new threat. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't say a word. Her instincts screamed for action, but something about the situation was holding her back. The figure's gaze locked onto Harris, and for a moment, it felt like time slowed down. There was no need for introductions, no need for pleasantries. The truth was clear. This was the one thing Harris had hoped he could avoid. The person he had hoped would never be involved in this twisted mess. "You've made your choices," the stranger said, taking a slow step forward. "You and your daughter." Their eyes flicked to Emily. "But what you both didn't realize, Harris, is that I've been waiting for this moment for a long time." Harris felt his stomach churn. He knew now. This wasn't just a random visitor. This was someone who had been pulling the strings all along, watching from the shadows, orchestrating everything. "You didn't think your little secret would stay hidden forever, did you?" the stranger continued. "It was never about protecting her, Harris. It was always about control. And now I'm here to take what's mine." The words were like ice, slicing through him with brutal clarity. Harris's mind raced, scrambling to piece together the puzzle. Who was this person? How were they connected to everything that had happened? And why, after all this time, were they revealing themselves now? "Who the hell are you?" Harris managed to croak, his voice barely a whisper, shaking with fear and disbelief. He could hardly believe the words that were coming out of his own mouth. The stranger smiled, a cruel twist of their lips. "You don't recognize me, do you?" They chuckled darkly. "But that's all right. You will soon enough." A sudden, jarring realization hit Harris. His blood ran cold. He had been so consumed with trying to protect his daughter, with trying to shield her from the fallout of her own actions, that he hadn't seen the bigger picture. The one he should have seen from the start. "You're—" Harris started, but the words stuck in his throat. It was too much. Too much to process all at once. The figure stepped closer, until they were standing only a few feet away. The air felt thick, heavy, oppressive, and Harris could hardly breathe. But then, they reached into their coat, pulling something out. A small, black envelope. They held it out toward him. "This is for you," they said, their voice cool, almost mocking. Harris took the envelope, his hands shaking. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to know what was inside. But he knew he had to. There was no avoiding it now. With trembling hands, he tore the envelope open. Inside was a single photograph. A picture of his brother, his dead brother. But there was something off about it. Something different. Harris's breath caught in his throat. The image wasn't just of his brother, it was a photo of him, standing with someone. Someone he knew. Someone he had trusted. Someone who had betrayed him. His stomach churned as the truth hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. The person in the photograph wasn't just a stranger. It was the person standing in front of him. It was the one who had been orchestrating everything from the shadows. The person who had turned his daughter into what she was. And in that moment, Harris realized the full extent of his betrayal. It wasn't just his daughter who had killed. It was the two of them, together. And now, the game was over. The figure smiled again, that same cruel smile, as if they had been waiting for this moment. "Welcome to the real world, Harris." And with that, everything Harris thought he knew about his life and his family crumbled into nothing. Harris's heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears, drowning out everything else. His hands were clammy, his fingers numb, as he stared at the photograph in disbelief. It wasn't just a photo of his brother anymore. It was a portrait of the lies, the manipulation, and the darkness that had been lurking in the corners of his life all this time. The figure before him, this stranger, this puppet master, had been the one pulling all the strings. The one who had planted the seed of doubt in Emily's mind. The one who had turned his daughter into a murderer. The one who had orchestrated it all, from the very beginning. Harris's eyes flicked back to his daughter. She stood there, her expression unreadable. She hadn't flinched when the figure revealed themselves, hadn't reacted in any way. She was too calm, too detached. Like she had known, like she had always known. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment, Harris saw the truth reflected in them. She had never been his daughter. Not entirely. Not in the way he had believed. She was theirs. And they had made her into a weapon. A tool in a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, their gaze never leaving Harris. "You think you've been in control all this time, don't you?" they said, their voice smooth, almost soothing. "But you've always been a pawn, Harris. A pawn in a game you don't understand." The words felt like ice in his veins. The truth had shattered every illusion he had about his family, about his daughter, about himself. He was nothing more than a player in a game he hadn't been told the rules to. And now, the game was over. Harris's mind spun, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with a sickening clarity. The strange events, the whispers behind closed doors, the growing tension between him and Emily. It had all been leading up to this moment. The figure, the one in the photo, had been pulling the strings from the shadows, controlling everything, manipulating them all. He looked at the photograph again, the image of his brother's lifeless body standing next to the figure who had once been his friend. His heart sank. It was all a lie. His brother's death wasn't an accident, wasn't a random act of violence. It had been planned. It had been orchestrated. And he had walked right into it. "You didn't just lose your brother," the figure continued, their eyes glinting with cold amusement. "You lost everything. Everything you thought you knew." Harris's mind felt like it was collapsing under the weight of their words. He had spent so much time trying to protect Emily, trying to make the right choices, trying to be a father. But he had failed. He had failed because he had never seen the truth. "Why?" he managed to choke out, his voice raw, broken. "Why her? Why me?" The figure's lips curled into a slow smile, one that sent a chill down Harris's spine. "Because, Harris, you were always the weak link. You were too blinded by love, by guilt, to see the bigger picture." Emily's gaze shifted ever so slightly, but she said nothing. She was like a shadow now, an extension of the figure standing before them, moving only when they moved. Her silence was deafening, and Harris felt the crushing weight of it. She had never been his daughter. She had been a tool in a game that had been designed long before she was born. "How long?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been planning this?" The figure chuckled, low and dangerous. "Longer than you think. This has been a long time coming, Harris. And now, it's finally time for you to understand your place." The air seemed to close in around him. The room felt smaller, suffocating. He wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, to escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. Not anymore. "Your daughter's a murderer," the figure continued, their voice cutting through the silence. "But she's not the only one who's been playing this game." Harris felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He couldn't breathe. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. This was something far more dangerous. And he was caught in the middle of it. He looked at Emily again, her expression unreadable, her hand still loosely holding the weapon. She was part of this now. She had always been part of it. The figure took another step forward, the sound of their shoes scraping against the floor echoing in the room. "You've lost, Harris," they said, their voice almost tender now, as if speaking to a broken man who had no hope left. "You just don't know it yet." And then, in a sudden movement, the figure gestured to Emily. She stepped forward, her expression shifting, just slightly. Her eyes, once cold and distant, softened for a fraction of a second. It was the faintest flicker, but Harris saw it. A glimpse of the daughter he had once known. And for that one fleeting moment, he thought he might still be able to save her. But that hope was quickly crushed when she raised the weapon, aiming it straight at him. Her finger tightened on the trigger. And Harris knew, with agonizing clarity, that there was no way out. The game had been played. And it was over. Harris's breath hitched in his chest as the cold barrel of the weapon stared back at him, its presence like a heavy weight in the room. His mind scrambled, looking for a way out, some last shred of hope that could undo this nightmare. But there was nothing. Nothing but the unrelenting truth of the moment. Emily's hand was steady, her fingers wrapped around the gun with an eerie calm. Her eyes, those eyes that had once been full of warmth and innocence, were now empty, cold, unyielding, and locked on him, her father. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream at her, to beg her to stop. He wanted to tell her how much he loved her, how much he had tried to protect her. But the words wouldn't come.
Not now.
Not when she had already made her choice. She wasn't the girl he had raised anymore. She wasn't the daughter who had clung to him in times of fear. She was something else. Something that he had helped to create. And now, that something was standing before him, aiming a gun at his chest. Harris couldn't tear his eyes away from her, even as the figure behind them took a step closer, a smug smile still playing at the corners of their lips. "See, Harris? You still don't get it," the figure said softly, almost pityingly. "You think you still have power. You think you can save her. But the truth is, she's already gone. And you're just another casualty of the game we've been playing." The words felt like poison in his veins. They were right. There was no saving her. He had tried to protect her, to shield her from the truth, but in doing so, he had helped to shape the monster she had become. And now, that monster was standing in front of him, with a weapon in hand, ready to end him. "Emily," Harris whispered, his voice hoarse. His throat felt raw, as if the very act of speaking had drained him of all his strength. He didn't know what he was asking for, redemption, forgiveness, a miracle? But he knew it was futile. The look in her eyes told him that she was already too far gone. "Don't," he managed, his voice cracking. "Please don't do this." But Emily didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Her finger was still on the trigger. Her expression hadn't changed. And then, in a single, breathless moment, everything seemed to collapse inward. The room spun. Harris's world went silent, the pounding of his heart deafening in his ears. He didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know if he could survive this. A sharp noise cut through the air. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of something shifting, someone moving.
Emma.
In the blink of an eye, she had pulled her own gun. Her aim was steady, her eyes locked onto Emily, but there was no hesitation in her movements. She was trained. She was fast. "Emily, put it down," Emma commanded, her voice firm and unwavering. The tension in the room snapped, the air thick with the promise of violence. But Emily didn't waver. She didn't lower the gun. Harris's breath caught. Was Emma going to shoot? Would she really do it? "Please," Harris whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The desperation in his voice cut through the thick silence, but there was no way to undo what had already been set in motion. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it happened. A shot rang out. But it wasn't from Emily's gun. The loud crack of a bullet splitting the air made Harris's heart leap into his throat. It was from Emma's. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Emily's body jerked, her eyes wide in shock. The gun in her hand wavered for a fraction of a second. And in that second, Harris's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know whether to feel relief or horror. Relief that his daughter hadn't pulled the trigger. Horror because, in that moment, it was clear that Emma had done what had to be done. Had she just saved his life? Or had she sealed their fate? Emily stumbled back, her hand dropping the weapon. The room held its breath, as if the entire world had paused to witness the fallout. She looked down at her chest, a thin line of blood beginning to soak through her clothes. The shock in her eyes was palpable, but there was no pain in her expression. Only confusion. And, perhaps, just for a moment, regret. But it was too late for regret. Too late for apologies. Harris's chest tightened. His gaze flicked between Emma and Emily. He wanted to rush to his daughter, to hold her, to tell her it would be okay, but it was already over. The damage had been done. They had both crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Emma's face was cold. She lowered her gun, but there was no relief in her eyes. There was only the haunting weight of what she had just done. Harris's world was falling apart. And in that moment, As Emily crumpled to the ground, it became clear. There was no saving anyone anymore. The game was over. Harris stood frozen, his chest tight, his body numb as he watched his daughter crumple to the ground. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, her hand clutching the wound as though trying to hold onto the life that was slipping away from her. The blood was bright, a stark contrast against her pale skin, and for a moment, the room was filled only with the sound of her ragged breathing. The gun dropped from Emily's fingers, clattering against the floor like a distant echo of the violence that had just transpired. Her body trembled, but not from fear. From something deeper, something more tragic. Harris couldn't move,
couldn't speak.
All he could do was watch, helpless, as his daughter, his own flesh and blood, faded away before his eyes. "Emily," Harris whispered, his voice barely a breath. His legs felt like lead as he took a hesitant step toward her, but Emma's voice stopped him. "Don't, Harris. It's too late." Emma's words were soft but firm, carrying the weight of what had just transpired. She stood there, her gun still in hand, her expression unreadable. She had done what was necessary, but the cost of that decision had already torn through them all. Harris's eyes darted to Emma, searching for some sign of regret, some sign that there was still hope. But there was nothing. Her face was a mask, hardened by years of making impossible choices. And yet, something in her gaze faltered, as if she, too, knew there was no coming back from what they had just done. "Why?" Harris choked out, his voice breaking as he sank to his knees beside his daughter. Why had it come to this? Why had he failed her? Why hadn't he seen it sooner? But Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Her breaths were shallow now, the blood spreading across her shirt, staining everything she had once been. Harris reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as he gently took hold of it, feeling the last warmth of life slowly slipping away. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over, his words lost in the heavy silence that filled the room. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She was gone. Emma took a slow step back, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. She had done what needed to be done, but the price of their survival was too high. Too much had been lost, too many lines crossed, and now they were left with the wreckage. "I know," Emma said quietly. "Believe me, I know." Her gaze shifted to the window, as though trying to escape the scene before them. But there was no escape. Not anymore. The room felt colder now. The world outside, once full of promise, seemed distant, unreal. There was nothing left but the broken remnants of a life that had once held so much hope. Harris looked down at his daughter's lifeless body, his chest aching with the weight of 1,000 regrets. And for the first time, he truly understood the depth of the destruction that had been set in motion. The game was over, and they had all lost. Harris stood over his daughter, the silence between them a suffocating blanket. Her once bright eyes had dimmed, and the warmth of her touch had faded. He couldn't believe it, couldn't understand how they had arrived here. How his love for her, his attempts to protect her, had only pushed them toward this point of no return. He had failed her. He had failed to see the darkness that had always lingered beneath the surface. He had failed to protect her from the forces that had shaped her, twisted her into something unrecognizable. The girl he had raised was gone. In her place was something far more dangerous. And he had been blind to it. Emma's face was a mask of resolve, but Harris could see the flicker of something in her eyes. Regret? Guilt? It didn't matter now. The damage had been done. "Is she?" Harris whispered, his voice trembling, his throat tight with unshed tears. He couldn't bring himself to finish the question. Couldn't bear to ask if the daughter he had once known was truly gone, or if there was still a chance to pull her back from the edge. But Emma only nodded slowly. "Yeah, Harris. She's gone." The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, he was paralyzed. He had been too late, too slow, too naive to see the truth until it was too late. The world around him seemed to blur as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, had crumbled in an instant. And now, all that was left was the ruin of his family, the aftermath of choices that couldn't be undone. He closed his eyes, his breath shaky, and let the tears fall, feeling the sting of loss deep within his chest. He hadn't been able to save her. He hadn't been able to save himself. "Where do we go from here?" Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper, broken with the weight of it all. He wasn't sure who he was asking, Emma, the empty room, or himself. It didn't matter. The answer was the same. There was nowhere left to go. Emma looked down at the scene before them, her face unreadable. Her gaze flickered briefly to Harris before turning away. "Nowhere," she said softly. "There's no going back." The finality in her voice echoed in Harris's mind. They had crossed a line, and no matter how much they wished they could undo it, there was no undoing what had been done. The game had ended, and there were no winners. He looked at Emily one last time, a part of him still hoping for something, a sign, a flicker of recognition. But there was nothing. Just the stillness, the emptiness that now filled the space where his daughter once stood. Harris stood up, his legs weak, his body heavy with grief. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel anymore. He didn't know how to move on, how to find a way forward. All he knew was that his life, their lives, had been irrevocably shattered. And as the cold night air drifted in through the window, the last of the light from the street lamp casting shadows across the floor, Harris realized that there was no way out. The truth had been revealed, and they were all left to face the consequences of their actions. The end.